The first crack in a family's happiness was so quiet that no one heard it, yet by the time the echoes reached the halls of Ashford Castle, trust had already begun to die. Behind polished smiles and graceful curtsies, one ambitious woman measured every heartbeat of the household like a hunter studying wounded prey. She did not need swords or poison. She needed only patience, deception, and a husband whose greatest strength could be turned into his greatest weakness. Duke Adrian Ashford possessed everything England admired. At 36, he was celebrated as a brilliant strategist whose calm judgment had preserved lives during military campaigns and protected estates through years of political uncertainty. Noblemen respected him, servants trusted him, and neighboring families spoke of his fairness with quiet admiration. Yet beneath his disciplined exterior rested an old wound that never truly healed. Years earlier, misplaced trust had cost his younger brother his life after a supposed ally betrayed confidential military plans. Since that day Adrian forgave many faults but never betrayal. The very thought of it chilled his heart faster than winter ever could. Only one person seemed capable of melting that hidden frost. Lady Eleanor Ashford, 25, carried kindness with effortless elegance. She possessed neither vanity nor hunger for influence, preferring nursery songs over ballroom gossip and afternoon walks with her children instead of fashionable gatherings. Every morning she personally braided Charlotte's hair, listened patiently to Henry's endless questions about knights and explorers, and rocked baby Arthur to sleep while humming melodies learned from her own mother. Servants often whispered that Ashford Castle felt less like a palace whenever Eleanor laughed and more like a home. Henry, 8 years old, adored following his father through the estate while secretly believing his mother solved every problem better than any duke ever could. Charlotte, 6, collected pressed flowers and tucked them inside storybooks Eleanor read each evening. Little Arthur, barely 8 months old, reached instinctively for his mother's embrace whenever unfamiliar faces approached. Their happiness was simple, unpretentious, and complete. Someone watched that happiness with growing resentment. Lady Vivian Blackwood entered every room draped in beauty polished to perfection. At 29, her graceful manners, sparkling wit, and flawless appearance convinced nearly everyone she embodied refinement itself. Yet beneath embroidered silks lay desperation sharp enough to carve through innocence. Hidden debts consumed her family's fortune. Creditors circled relentlessly, and bankruptcy waited like a wolf beyond the gates. Becoming Duchess was no longer a dream. It was survival. She understood that Eleanor's downfall had to appear entirely self-inflicted. The scheme unfolded slowly enough that no single event seemed suspicious. A dismissed secretary with remarkable talent for copying handwriting accepted generous payment to imitate Eleanor's elegant script. 2 struggling servants received purses heavy with gold in exchange for carefully rehearsed testimony. A loyal maid unknowingly carried sealed envelopes that later disappeared before mysteriously reappearing inside Eleanor's writing desk. Every tiny deception rested upon another until falsehood resembled undeniable truth. The forged letters painted an unforgivable portrait. They claimed Eleanor intended to flee England with the Ashford heirs and secretly seek protection among political radicals across the Channel. Other pages hinted that she considered the crown corrupt and believed her children deserved freedom beyond royal influence. Every sentence echoed with convincing emotion because Vivian had spent months studying Eleanor's genuine correspondence before creating perfect imitations. Then came the planted evidence. A hidden travel purse appeared beneath Eleanor's wardrobe filled with foreign currency. Children's passports, expertly fabricated, surfaced inside a locked cabinet only she supposedly could access. Jewelry disappeared from the family vault before being discovered, wrapped inside one of Eleanor's shawls. Each revelation deepened suspicion while Vivian publicly expressed compassionate disbelief. "There must be some misunderstanding," she murmured before assembled servants, gently defending Eleanor just enough to appear loyal while subtly repeating every accusation. "Her Grace has always seemed devoted. Surely someone should investigate before reaching conclusions." Those carefully chosen words accomplished exactly what she intended. Adrian began investigating himself. He entered Eleanor's sitting room expecting to disprove impossible allegations. Instead, he uncovered another forged letter hidden beneath a stack of children's sketches. His hands trembled as familiar handwriting declared plans to leave forever. Memories of his brother's betrayal surged violently through his mind. Every instinct demanding caution drowned beneath fear. He confronted Eleanor that evening beside the nursery fireplace while Arthur slept peacefully against her shoulder. She stared at the letter in stunned silence. "I have never seen this," she whispered. "I found it with my own hands. Someone wants you to believe lies. Then explain everything." I cannot explain what I never wrote. Her confusion sounded painfully sincere, yet grief had already clouded Adrian's judgment. Every unanswered question felt like another concealed secret. Eleanor begged him to examine the servants, the seals, the ink, anything that might reveal forgery. Instead, he walked away carrying Arthur without another word. Vivian found him alone later that night overlooking the rain-soaked gardens. She spoke softly, never condemning Eleanor outright, merely suggesting painful possibilities a wounded husband already feared. Perhaps love had changed. Perhaps hidden ambitions had awakened. Perhaps even devoted hearts sometimes wandered beyond forgiveness. Each careful sentence tightened invisible chains around Adrian's faith until doubt became certainty. Within days, whispers escaped the castle walls. Newspapers hinted at scandal involving one of England's most respected noble families. Court officials received anonymous documents demanding immediate protection of the Ashford heirs. Because the accusations touched succession, inheritance, and the safety of children destined to carry one of England's oldest titles, the royal court ordered an emergency custody hearing before Lord Justice Edmund Carlisle. The courtroom overflowed with nobles, reporters, clergy, and curious spectators. Eleanor stood pale but dignified, Arthur sleeping in her arms while Henry clutched one side of her gown and Charlotte trembled against the other. Vivian waited beside Adrian with flawless composure, every expression measured, every breath rehearsed. Lord Justice Carlisle surveyed the crowded chamber without revealing a single emotion. Then Adrian stepped forward, lifted one shaking hand toward Eleanor, and declared, "You bore my heirs, but my mistress will raise them." The horrified silence that followed shattered Eleanor's heart before any verdict had even been spoken. The courtroom remained silent long after Adrian's cruel declaration faded into the towering wooden ceiling. Even seasoned barristers lowered their eyes, unable to ignore the devastation written across Eleanor's face. She did not plead for sympathy or collapse beneath humiliation. She simply tightened her trembling arms around baby Arthur while Henry and Charlotte clung desperately to her skirts, as though their small hands alone could prevent the world from tearing their family apart. Lord Justice Edmund Carlisle studied every face before speaking. His reputation for fairness was unmatched, and he refused to allow emotion to replace evidence. The accusations against Eleanor were severe, supported by documents, sworn testimony, and carefully arranged circumstances that appeared convincing despite the absence of certainty. With visible reluctance, he announced that the investigation would continue and that the children would remain temporarily under the Duke's legal custody until the truth could be established. His decision echoed through the courtroom like the closing of a prison gate. Henry cried out for his mother as a court officer gently separated him from her embrace. Charlotte buried her face against Eleanor's shoulder, refusing to let go until another servant carefully lifted her away. Baby Arthur awoke frightened by the confusion and stretched both tiny hands toward Eleanor, his desperate cries piercing every heart except one. Vivian watched the heartbreaking scene with lowered lashes, hiding the satisfaction burning beneath her carefully composed expression. Eleanor kissed each child before they were taken. She whispered promises that they would see one another again, though she had no certainty those words were true. Adrian avoided looking directly at her. His jaw remained rigid, his expression carved from wounded pride rather than hatred. He believed he was protecting his heirs from betrayal, and that belief blinded him more completely than any darkness. Outside the courthouse, newspaper reporters surrounded the Duke's carriage. Vivian stood beside Adrian with graceful dignity, speaking only of protecting innocent children until justice reached its conclusion. Her measured voice earned public admiration, while Eleanor quietly departed through a side entrance, wrapped in silence instead of scandal. Few noticed the lonely figure disappearing into the gray afternoon without husband, children, or home. Ashford Castle welcomed the children back beneath fluttering banners, yet warmth no longer lived within its stone walls. Henry wandered the corridors searching for familiar laughter that never came. Charlotte refused to unpack her favorite books because her mother had always arranged them beside her bed. Arthur cried through each night until exhausted servants carried him from room to room hoping sleep would eventually claim him. Vivian transformed herself into the picture of perfect devotion whenever Adrian entered the nursery. She ordered beautifully carved rocking horses, imported dolls dressed in Paris fashions, silver rattles for Arthur, and elaborate birthday celebrations despite no birthday approaching. She kissed little foreheads before the Duke, praised Henry's intelligence, complimented Charlotte's manners, and cradled Arthur with convincing tenderness until Adrian smiled with grateful relief. Watching her apparent affection eased the doubts buried inside his heart. The moment Adrian departed for estate meetings, Every smile disappeared. Vivian handed Arthur to the nearest maid without another glance, complaining that infants smelled unpleasant and ruined expensive gowns. Henry was ordered to remain inside his bedroom whenever guests visited because his sadness disturbed the cheerful atmosphere she wished to create. Charlotte reached one afternoon for her beloved cloth doll, only to watch Vivian snatch it away, tear its faded dress, and toss the broken toy into the fireplace. "You are too old for childish attachments," Vivian said coldly. "Forget your mother. Forget these ridiculous memories. I will decide what belongs in this house now." Charlotte wept until sleep claimed her. Henry silently gathered the doll's burned remains after everyone left, wrapping the blackened fabric inside his pillowcase so his sister would still possess something their mother once held. Servants exchanged uneasy glances but dared not interfere. Those who questioned Vivian found themselves dismissed from their duties or threatened with accusations of disloyalty. Fear spread quietly through Ashford Castle, replacing the gentle rhythm Eleanor had once created with suspicion and whispered conversations behind locked doors. Autumn arrived wrapped in relentless rain. One violent evening, thunder shook the castle windows while icy wind howled across the moors. Arthur suddenly developed a fierce fever that left his tiny body trembling with alarming weakness. The frightened nurse begged Vivian to summon the physician immediately. "He can wait until morning," Vivian replied without lifting her eyes from an expensive necklace she admired before the mirror. "I will not interrupt tonight's guests because of one restless baby." The nurse hesitated, terrified of disobeying. Henry overheard every word from the hallway. After midnight he quietly climbed through his bedroom window, lowered himself onto the rain-soaked garden wall, and raced toward the village despite fierce wind and blinding darkness. Mud swallowed his boots, branches tore his sleeves, and freezing rain soaked him to the skin, but he refused to stop. When the exhausted village doctor finally reached the castle before dawn, Arthur's fever had climbed dangerously high. Hours later the infant's breathing steadied, though the physician privately admitted another delay might have claimed the child's life. Henry never revealed how he had found help. Adrian praised the doctor for arriving so quickly, believing loyal servants had acted responsibly. Vivian accepted his gratitude with graceful humility while hiding her irritation behind another flawless smile. Far away from the castle, Eleanor packed her remaining belongings into a single weathered trunk. She returned once beneath the iron gates of Ashford Castle before sunrise, placing one trembling hand upon the cold stone pillar where Henry had measured his height each birthday. Tears blurred her vision as she kissed the gate, whispered each child's name into the empty morning air, and turned away before grief could steal the last fragments of her strength. She disappeared into the falling rain, carrying nothing except memories, faith, and a mother's love that no courtroom could ever confiscate. Morning arrived quietly over the small village where Eleanor had begun rebuilding a life no court could imagine. The abandoned stone chapel she rented with the last of her jewelry still leaked whenever rain swept across the hills, its wooden floor creaked beneath every step, and its walls carried the chill of neglected years. Yet each sunrise found her lighting a single candle before opening the heavy door, believing that even the smallest refuge could become a sanctuary for someone with nowhere else to go. The first child arrived barefoot, clutching a torn blanket and shivering beneath threadbare clothes. Eleanor welcomed the frightened little girl without asking questions, prepared warm porridge over a modest stove, washed scraped knees with gentle hands, and tucked her into a narrow bed. Before sunset another orphan appeared, then a hungry widow carrying twins too weak to stand, then an elderly man asking only for bread. Eleanor never turned anyone away, even when sharing meant she herself skipped meals. Every act of kindness softened wounds that wealth alone could never heal. Villagers noticed that remarkable compassion. Mothers struggling through illness trusted her with their children. Farmers left baskets of vegetables outside the chapel door before dawn. Bakers quietly delivered fresh loaves each morning. Carpenters repaired broken windows without requesting payment. Word spread from village to village until travelers began speaking of a noble woman who had lost everything yet continued giving away whatever remained. They no longer called her Duchess Eleanor. Instead, people whispered a new title with heartfelt admiration. The Duchess without a crown. Eleanor accepted neither praise nor attention. Every evening, after the children she sheltered drifted peacefully asleep, she unfolded 3 tiny garments she had carried from Ashford Castle. One of Henry's worn gloves, Charlotte's faded ribbon, and Arthur's first knitted cap. She pressed each treasured keepsake against her heart before kneeling in silent prayer. She asked for nothing except her children's safety. Hope became her only inheritance. Inside Ashford Castle, prosperity slowly disguised growing decay. Lady Vivian Blackwood spent lavishly, replacing antique furniture with fashionable imports, purchasing gowns stitched with extravagant embroidery, and hosting elegant gatherings that celebrated appearances rather than family. Rare paintings disappeared from ancestral halls, sold quietly to finance her endless appetite for luxury. Estate ledgers grew increasingly troubling, yet Adrian remained consumed by legal proceedings, land disputes, and responsibilities that pulled him farther from the nursery each passing week. Whenever guests praised Vivian's generosity, she smiled gracefully and accepted every compliment. Once the drawing rooms emptied, impatience replaced charm. She criticized servants over trivial mistakes, dismissed long-time employees for imagined disloyalty, and filled the castle with anxious silence. Laughter that once echoed through sunny corridors vanished beneath cautious footsteps and lowered voices. Henry changed most visibly. The cheerful boy who had once raced across gardens with wooden swords now spent hours staring through his bedroom window toward distant roads, wondering whether his mother might somehow appear beyond the trees. Every night he secretly wrote another letter. Sometimes he described Arthur learning new sounds. Sometimes he promised Charlotte tried to stay brave. Often he simply wrote that he missed her. Each page ended with the same heartbreaking words. "Please come home, Mama." Henry entrusted the letters to a young kitchen maid who believed she could slip unnoticed beyond the gates. Unfortunately, Vivian's watchful eyes missed little. She intercepted every message before it reached the village, unfolded each page with amused contempt, and fed the paper into glowing fireplace embers. She watched the words curl into black ash without the slightest trace of regret. Charlotte suffered differently. She no longer cried loudly because tears only invited punishment. Instead, she wandered the nursery carrying invisible conversations with memories no one else could hear. She tucked imaginary blankets around empty chairs, pretending her mother still sat nearby reading bedtime stories. Servants often found her asleep beside the nursery door, clutching the charred remains of her favorite doll beneath one small arm. Baby Arthur never understood the accusations that had divided his family, yet instinct guided him with remarkable certainty. Whenever Vivian attempted to lift him before visitors, he twisted away, reaching desperately toward nurses instead. He laughed freely with cooks, gardeners, stable hands, and elderly maids, but became strangely silent whenever Vivian approached. Her expensive perfumes never comforted him. Her practiced smiles never earned his trust. Only one person recognized the deeper meaning behind the children's quiet suffering. Mrs. Margaret Whitmore had served Ashford Castle since Adrian himself was an infant. Age had bent her back but sharpened her understanding of human hearts. She remembered Eleanor comforting frightened servants during illness, carrying food to grieving widows, and spending sleepless nights beside sick children without complaint. Nothing about the accusations resembled the woman Margaret knew. Instead of allowing Henry's letters to vanish forever, Margaret secretly gathered the burned fragments after Vivian left each room. Night after night she patiently pieced together blackened edges like a puzzle assembled from heartbreak. She hid every surviving page inside an old family Bible beneath loose nursery floorboards, adding notes about strange payments, suspicious visitors, dismissed servants, and unexplained purchases. She collected truth quietly because truth spoken too early often died unheard. Weeks passed. Small inconsistencies began troubling Adrian despite every effort to ignore them. Arthur reached eagerly for stable boys yet cried whenever Vivian held him. Charlotte startled awake from recurring nightmares, calling desperately for Eleanor. Henry stopped asking questions altogether, replacing childhood curiosity with guarded silence that unsettled even his father. Trusted servants resigned unexpectedly, offering vague explanations that never sounded convincing. Late one rain-soaked evening, Adrian wandered into the nursery after returning from estate business. The rooms felt colder than he remembered. Toys remained untouched. Charlotte slept clutching blackened cloth beneath her cheek. Henry pretended to sleep while tears silently dampened his pillow. Arthur stirred restlessly in his cradle, whispering the first recognizable sound he had ever repeated again and again. "Mama." Hidden beneath the floor, Mrs. Whitmore carefully opened the old Bible and unfolded another rescued letter. She added it beside dozens already preserved, then whispered into the darkness, "The truth is patient." Neither she nor the sleeping children noticed faint footsteps outside the nursery door, where someone had paused just long enough to hear everything before disappearing into the silent corridor. For the first time in many months, the silence inside Ashford Castle no longer felt ordinary. It felt watchful. Invisible cracks had begun spreading through the magnificent estate, and every lie that once seemed unshakable now trembled beneath the weight of its own deception. Truth had moved patiently through hidden corners, whispered between faithful hearts, and waited for the moment when no amount of influence could silence it again. Mrs. Margaret Whitmore barely slept after hearing footsteps outside the nursery that rainy evening. She had not recognized who lingered beyond the door, yet instinct warned her that time had become dangerously short. Before sunrise she retrieved the worn family Bible hidden beneath the nursery floorboards and carefully wrapped it inside plain linen. Between its fragile pages rested every surviving fragment of Henry's burned letters, receipts copied from estate ledgers, notes describing suspicious payments, and dates she had quietly recorded since Eleanor's removal from the castle. She knew evidence meant nothing if buried forever. Across the village, the physician who had treated baby Arthur during the terrible fever received an unexpected visitor. A former footman from Ashford Castle, pale and weakened by illness, requested a private conversation before he died. 4 months' guilt had consumed him more fiercely than disease. He confessed that Vivian had bribed servants to swear false testimony, ordered forged letters hidden inside Eleanor's chambers, and threatened dismissal or imprisonment to anyone who questioned her commands. The physician immediately escorted the trembling man before a local magistrate, where every confession was carefully documented under oath. News traveled swiftly. Within days, officers from the royal court arrived at Ashford Castle carrying warrants authorizing a renewed investigation. Servants who had once remained silent discovered unexpected courage after learning someone else had finally spoken. One maid admitted she had unknowingly carried sealed envelopes later planted among Eleanor's belongings. Another confessed receiving money merely for claiming she witnessed secret meetings that never occurred. A stable hand revealed mysterious visitors arriving after midnight to deliver packages directly to Vivian. Each statement weakened the magnificent illusion she had built. Adrian watched the investigation unfold with growing disbelief. Every answer uncovered another question. Every witness contradicted the certainty upon which he had destroyed his own family. He ordered old account books examined, servants recalled, correspondence rechecked, and handwriting experts consulted. One respected examiner concluded the supposed letters written by Eleanor displayed remarkable imitation but subtle inconsistencies impossible for their true author to produce. Adrian's confidence shattered piece by piece. He entered the abandoned nursery late one evening carrying one of the forged letters beside an authentic note Eleanor had once written after Henry's birth. Until that moment he had never compared them himself. Now the differences appeared painfully obvious. Certain flourishes lacked Eleanor's natural rhythm. Several favored expressions never appeared. Tiny details he should have recognized immediately stood before him like accusations. His hands began trembling. Not because Eleanor had deceived him. Because she never had. Meanwhile, officers searched Vivian's private apartments. Hidden beneath false compartments inside an ornate writing desk they discovered unpaid debt notices, correspondence from impatient creditors, and letters exchanged with her banker discussing marriage as the only remaining path to preserving her fortune. Another locked drawer contained receipts documenting unusually large cash withdrawals matching payments secretly distributed among former servants. Vivian remained astonishingly calm. She insisted every document had innocent explanations. She blamed jealous employees. She accused Margaret of fabricating stories because old age had clouded her judgment. She even suggested Eleanor orchestrated the investigation to regain sympathy. Her confidence unsettled many observers. Yet Margaret quietly stepped forward carrying the wrapped Bible. She placed it gently upon the courtroom evidence table after the case reopened before Lord Justice Edmund Carlisle. The elderly judge recognized her immediately. "You have something important?" he asked. Margaret nodded. "I have the truth children were never meant to lose." With careful hands she unfolded Henry's rescued letters one by one. Although fire had scarred many pages, enough survived to reveal a frightened little boy begging endlessly for his mother. He described Charlotte crying herself asleep. He described Arthur's terrible fever. He described punishments whenever Eleanor's name was spoken. Every letter ended exactly the same. "Please come home, Mama." The courtroom grew unbearably still. Several jurors quietly wiped away tears. Even hardened newspaper reporters stopped writing. Adrian stared at the fragile pages as though every burned edge had been carved directly into his conscience. Then the village physician testified. He described Arthur's life-threatening illness. He admitted arriving only because Henry had crossed dangerous countryside alone during a violent storm after Vivian refused to summon help. Henry himself confirmed every word with quiet honesty. He did not accuse. He simply answered each question. When asked why he risked his life, he looked toward the floor and whispered, Mama always said no child should ever be left hurting. Those simple words wounded Adrian more deeply than any accusation. Finally, the bank manager entered the witness box carrying ledgers seized during the investigation. He reluctantly admitted Vivian's finances had completely collapsed months before Eleanor's disgrace. Without marrying Adrian, bankruptcy and public humiliation were inevitable. Every motive suddenly stood exposed. Every lie finally possessed a purpose. Vivian's elegant composure began slipping. For the first time, genuine fear crossed her face. She rose dramatically, insisting she had sacrificed everything for Adrian and the children. She blamed servants, bankers, investigators, and even Henry's imagination. She claimed Margaret forged evidence out of misplaced affection. Her desperate voice echoed through the chamber, growing louder with every sentence until even she seemed unable to distinguish invention from reality. Lord Justice Carlyle listened without interruption. When silence finally returned, the elderly judge slowly removed his spectacles and folded his hands upon the bench. His weathered eyes settled first upon Eleanor. She stood exactly as she had months earlier. Calm, dignified, not triumphant. She had never demanded revenge. Only truth. The judge then looked toward Adrian. The proud duke who had once entered the courtroom certain of betrayal now appeared like a man crushed beneath invisible chains. Regret hollowed his expression. Shame stole every trace of authority from his voice before he even attempted to speak. Lord Justice Carlyle rose. No one moved. No chair creaked. No paper rustled. Every soul inside the courtroom waited. The judge's voice carried neither anger nor celebration. Only absolute certainty. The greatest mother stands before this court, not your mistress. The words settled across the chamber with extraordinary force. No lengthy speech followed. None was necessary. In those 9 words, every forged letter lost its power. Every lie collapsed. Every sacrifice Eleanor had endured received the justice it deserved. Vivian's face drained of color as court officers stepped toward her. She reached instinctively for Adrian, expecting rescue, but he never moved. He could only watch in horrified silence while guards placed iron restraints around the woman he had trusted above his own wife. Convicted of fraud, forgery, perjury, conspiracy, and child cruelty, she was led from the courtroom as whispers of disgust replaced the admiration she had once carefully cultivated. Adrian remained frozen where he stood, unable to follow anyone, unable to forgive himself, while only one thought echoed relentlessly through his shattered heart. Eleanor was free, but would she ever allow him to find her again? The verdict spread across England faster than the autumn wind. Newspapers that had once condemned Eleanor now printed apologies in bold ink. Villagers who had quietly defended her wept openly after learning how deeply she had been wronged. Yet the woman at the center of every headline remained exactly where she had always wished to be, not inside a palace, but inside the modest orphan home where frightened children still reached for her hand before sunrise. Eleanor refused every invitation to return immediately to Ashford Castle. She thanked the officials who delivered the court's decision, accepted legal custody of her children, and then resumed stirring soup for 30 hungry orphans as though titles and scandals belonged to another lifetime. She had spent months learning that peace did not grow from wealth or admiration. It grew from purpose. Every child she comforted reminded her that suffering could become compassion if someone chose kindness over bitterness. Adrian, meanwhile, discovered that justice offered no relief from guilt. The court had cleared Eleanor's name, but no judgment could erase the memory of Henry crying inside the courtroom, Charlotte reaching desperately toward her mother, or Arthur stretching tiny hands toward the woman he had allowed strangers to take away. He wandered through Ashford Castle as though every corridor accused him. Eleanor's music room remained untouched. The nursery still held Charlotte's repaired doll. Arthur's cradle stood beneath the window where moonlight once painted silver across peaceful nights. The castle had regained its silence, but it no longer felt noble. It felt empty. Henry spoke little to his father after the trial. Respect remained because Adrian was still his father, yet trust had become fragile. Charlotte answered questions politely before retreating into long moments of quiet reflection. Arthur, now strong and healthy, smiled at almost everyone except Adrian, whose unfamiliar sadness confused the little boy. The Duke realized that children did not measure love by power. They remembered presence, protection, and promises kept. One morning Adrian dismissed his carriage and rode alone to the village where Eleanor lived. He wore no ceremonial coat, no jeweled sword, and no symbols of rank beyond the wedding ring he had never removed. When he reached the orphan home, he found Eleanor kneeling beside a little boy whose torn boot she patiently stitched with steady hands. Around her, children laughed while sweeping floors, reading books, and tending a vegetable garden that flourished despite poor soil. She looked up. Their eyes met. Neither spoke. The silence carried more truth than any courtroom testimony. Adrian finally lowered his gaze. "I came to ask nothing for myself," he said quietly. "Only to help if you'll allow it." Eleanor studied him for a long moment before handing him a broken wooden bucket. "The well needs water. Nothing more. No forgiveness. No anger. Only work." From that day forward Adrian returned each morning. He repaired leaking roofs, chopped firewood, hauled sacks of grain, painted weathered fences, and carried frightened toddlers whenever storms frightened them. The villagers watched curiously as one of England's most powerful noblemen worked beside laborers without complaint. He accepted muddy boots, blistered hands, aching muscles, and simple meals served at rough wooden tables. Every act became another quiet apology spoken through service instead of words. Weeks passed before Henry willingly approached him. The boy silently offered his father a hammer while repairing an old chicken coop. Adrian accepted it with trembling gratitude. Neither mentioned the past. Yet something small and precious began rebuilding between them. Charlotte's heart softened differently. She noticed Adrian patiently reading stories to orphan girls after supper, changing Arthur's clothes without asking servants for assistance, and comforting frightened children awakened by nightmares. One evening she slipped her tiny hand into his while they walked through the garden. "You don't look angry anymore," she whispered. "I'm angry only with myself." Charlotte squeezed his fingers. "Then don't stay there forever." Those innocent words became another lesson he never forgot. Arthur required no explanations. One afternoon he stumbled while chasing butterflies across the meadow. Adrian caught him before he fell. Instead of crying, the little boy laughed and wrapped both arms around his father's neck. Adrian closed his eyes, holding his son with overwhelming relief, silently thanking heaven for a second chance he knew he had never deserved. The orphan home soon overflowed beyond its modest walls. More abandoned children arrived every week, and neighboring villages asked Eleanor to expand her work. Adrian sold several unused hunting lodges, donated the proceeds anonymously, and quietly arranged additional teachers, physicians, and supplies. When Eleanor eventually discovered who had financed the expansion, she confronted him beneath the old oak tree overlooking the meadow. "You cannot purchase forgiveness," she said gently. "I know. You cannot erase what happened." "I know. Then why?" He looked toward dozens of children laughing across the grass. "Because this is the family you built after I destroyed the one we had." For the first time since their separation, tears filled Eleanor's eyes not from grief, but from seeing genuine humility replace wounded pride. Months later, Lord Justice Edmund Carlisle announced that the restored Ashford family would receive public recognition for establishing England's largest privately funded orphan foundation. Nobles, clergy, judges, villagers, and newspaper editors gathered outside Ashford Castle, whose gates opened once more, not for extravagant celebrations, but for hundreds of children who now called its halls home. Classrooms replaced lavish ballrooms. Libraries filled former reception chambers. The grand dining hall welcomed every orphan regardless of birth or fortune. Before the assembled crowd, Adrian requested permission to speak. He walked to the center of the courtyard, then slowly turned toward Eleanor. Without hesitation, the Duke of Ashford lowered himself onto one knee. Gasps swept through the audience. Kings honored knights. Subjects knelt before nobles. But almost no one had ever witnessed a duke kneel publicly before his own wife. "I believed forged papers instead of the woman who gave me every reason to trust her," Adrian said, his voice breaking. "I protected my pride while you protected our children. I called another woman worthy of raising the heirs you carried with love. Every honorable thing people once believed about me became meaningless because I failed the person who deserved my faith above all others. I cannot ask you to forget. I cannot ask you to excuse my blindness. I ask only for the opportunity to spend whatever years remain proving that truth has finally reached my heart." No one breathed. Henry watched anxiously. Charlotte clasped Arthur's tiny hand. The children from the orphan home gathered around Eleanor in complete silence. She looked first at the countless abandoned boys and girls now safely sheltered within Ashford Castle. She looked next at her own children, whose smiles had finally returned without fear. Last of all, she looked at Adrian. She remembered every cruel word, every lonely night, every tear. Yet she also saw blistered hands that had rebuilt roofs, weary shoulders that had carried hungry children, and a proud man transformed by sincere repentance instead of public disgrace. Slowly, Eleanor stepped forward. She did not lift him immediately. Instead, she placed Henry's hand into Adrian's. Charlotte's hand beside Henry's. Little Arthur's tiny fingers over both. Finally, she laid her own hand gently across theirs. "We begin again," she whispered. Applause erupted across the courtyard as tears streamed freely through the gathered crowd. Judge Carlyle smiled quietly from the front row, watching the broken family become whole again. Above the entrance to the new Ashford Children's Foundation, workers unveiled a carved stone inscription that would welcome every frightened child who crossed its threshold for generations to come. "The greatest mother stands before this court, not your mistress." No visitor ever forgot those words. Neither did the Duke, who spent the rest of his life ensuring he never again allowed fear to speak louder than love.